Everyone, this is Veda from Zephale Carmelite Mission. Today we are on the Holy Saturday, and we are expecting to celebrate the Easter Vigil this evening. And I would like to wish in advance all of you a very happy Easter. And I wish to continue my series on St. John of the Cross's The Dark Night, which has two books. The first book is on the passive purgation of the senses, and the second is The Dark Night of the Spirit, or the purgation of the spirit. So I completed book 1 last video, and in this video I'll be starting book 2, and I'll cover chapters 1 through 3. And if this is the first time you're watching this video series, I would request you to go back and watch from the beginning of this series, because St. John of the Cross is a great spiritual director, and it's very difficult to find any one saint who has shared so much about the spiritual life in such detail, with so many examples, analogies, and all the phases that the soul goes through before it comes to the union of the soul with God. And so we are all called to no longer just be beginners, but also to become proficients. And in order to do that, St. John of the Cross wants to help us. So in chapter 1, he speaks about the dark night of the spirit and how to recognize when the dark night of the spirit is beginning in a person's spiritual life. So he says the dark night of the spirit does not immediately come after the dark night of the senses, but usually there is a gap of several years, and the person is no longer bound by the discursive meditation that utilizes imagination, but as soon as a person sits down to pray or to meditate, the person is able to go into the spirit immediately and enjoy contemplation and spiritual delights. Now, the dark night of the spirit begins initially as short durations of time, and sometimes even it might last for days, but it comes in intervals. It doesn't come as a long, prolonged period, but it comes in short waves, and is followed by, so there'll be like a dark night for a short duration, and then it'll be followed by light and spiritual delights. Now, this occurs for a while before the person experiences the true dark night of the spirit that presides the divine union of the soul with God. So he says a person is no longer a beginner, but is proficient in the spiritual life. The senses are more pure after the purgation and are more capable to receive the benefits of contemplation. However, he says it is still weak and it is unprepared for, the term he uses, vigorous spiritual communications that are necessary before it goes through the spiritual night. So in order for the soul to attain divine union, very intense and strong spiritual communications are necessary. However, at this point, even after the purgation of the senses, even though the soul is pure and proficient, it is still weak and it cannot accept that level of intensity of the spiritual communication. So that's why the night of the spirit is essential. After the night of the spirit, the communication are purely spiritual, and it does not involve raptures, visions, or transports or bilocations of the soul or the bodily senses. So that's how it starts, it begins. And in chapter 2, he speaks of the imperfections and dangers that even a proficient spiritual person must confront in order to enter into the dark night of the spirit. And he says there are two kinds of imperfections that we must confront to enter the dark night of the spirit. The first one is habitual, and the second one is actual. The habitual imperfections, they remain in the spirit. So even though in the dark night of the senses, we purified it, but it is not fully purified because the roots of those habitual imperfections are still in the spirit. And the analogy he uses is a comparison of the sensory purgation versus the purgation of the spirit. He's saying it's like the sensory purgation is like you're cutting off the branch, but in the purgation of the spirit, you're uprooting the root. So both purgations, the sensory and the spirit, dark night of the spirit, both are preparatory steps for the union of the spirit with God. The other type of imperfection is the actual kind of imperfection. And often it is in the proficient soul that has experienced many spiritual communications like visions, raptures, and other spiritual apprehensions. And often it is these souls who are on this on this purgative way, they experience this, and they also are susceptible to tricks of the devil. So they may become tempted to become vain, and they may even have false visions and false prophecies. All of this become imperfections that will impede the progress of this spiritual person. And all of this is purified in the spiritual night before the person experiences the divine union with God. And since these spiritual communications like visions, ecstasies are felt by the senses, they still are, they belong to the lower part of the soul and not entirely belonging to the spirit, because we cannot, the senses cannot feel the presence of God, because it is far beyond our senses to feel the presence, actual presence of God. After the sensory and spiritual purgation, the soul becomes totally dark. And the soul becomes totally dark, and is only in pure faith the soul is able to accept the divine union of the spirit of the person and the spirit of God. In Hosea chapter 2, verse 20, we read, "I will unite you to me through faith." So that's what St. John of the Cross is speaking of when he speaks of, total darkness. When he speaks of dark night, he's speaking of the light of faith. That is what he's speaking of. And in chapter 3, that's the last chapter we'll cover for today, the arduous purgation of the spirit perfects both the senses and the spirit. So even though in the sensory night, the appetites of the senses are bridled or subdued, they are still present. They are not truly purged or fully eradicated. It is only in the night of the spirit that the senses are truly purged. So, in the spiritual night, both the senses and the spirit are purified. The reason for this that John of the Cross gives is that the imperfection disorders of the senses are in reality rooted in the spirit. So the sense cannot be completely purified until the evil habits are purged in the spirit. So the dark night of the spirit is what will truly purify the senses as well. The reason for this purification is that without the purification of the senses and the spirit, it is not possible for the human spirit, the spirit of the person, to be at a level worthy or made worthy by God himself, so that it can unite with the Spirit of God. So the person who has arrived at divine union performs mighty works, for his or her faculties and works are far more divine than human, because the person becomes so one with God. So God leaves the intellect, in the natural sense, God leaves the intellect in darkness, so it relies solely on pure faith. And God leaves the memory in emptiness, so it relies solely on hope. And God leaves the will in aridity, so freed from the passions of the will, that is, joy, fear, hope, sorrow, it will rely only on love. In this way, without any satisfactions or feelings in the senses or in the spirit is perfected, and the senses are perfected, and the spirit has now arrived at the threshold of divine union. So with that, we end Book 3. Again, I want to just share a very happy Easter to everyone. especially those who are going through difficult times. You can see in the crucifixion the patience and the love that Jesus came to show us through his very life. And this is the pivotal moment, the most crucial moment when Jesus forgives those who his executioners, and he loves them. He gives his life for them. And that is what it means to be a Christian. Christian is to give your life for your enemy. And that's when we become like Christ. It is humanly impossible, but it is only possible through the union with God, through our union with God in prayer. So prayer, as we have to pray ceaselessly in order to allow God to work in us so that we will all go from beginners to be more proficient, and eventually we will experience that divine union that St. John of the Cross speaks of. So have a happy Easter season, and I will talk to you in a couple of weeks.